Hello folks, I want to do a quick video for you on the difference between graded potentials and action potentials. So we've seen action potentials before, but we've mostly talked about them as kind of what they are and where they occur, but we haven't talked a ton or made explicit how they differ from other types of changes in transmembrane potential that neurons experience in terms of where they occur, what types of channels are involved, what ions are involved, how that transmembrane potential changes or doesn't over time and over space, and a variety of other things. So I want to do that for you quickly. We know all these things about an action potential, and I'm going to elaborate these on in just a minute. Um, so we're going to think about differences between these two, graded potentials and action potentials, right? So graded potentials and action potentials, where they occur, um, and what ions and what channels are involved. So if we're going to sort of replicate this figure or parts of this figure as I show you the differences between them. So when when we're thinking about these two, we're going to be keeping these learning outcomes in mind, right? And yes, these highlighted ones, comparing these potentials and then thinking about how graded potentials can have temporal and spatial summation, how action potentials don't, and why that difference exists, right? So be thinking about those. And to do that, I want to go to our sketchbook, and we're going to compare these two things. So what we have here is a neuron. This is our focal neuron that we'll be examining. Then we have a couple of other neurons that connect to it, right, that are connecting to this neuron. And then we have down here an action potential. I just want to draw your attention to some of the pieces of this before we compare these two. Okay, so let's just think in terms of where these occur. Action potentials, we know that they occur along this line here, or this axon here. So action potentials occur basically along here, right, all along the axon. Uh, right, so they're occurring along the axon. And graded potentials, on the other hand, are occurring here at the dendrites and the soma. And the reason they're occurring there is because they are basically collecting or responding to stimuli that are passed from presynaptic cells, where this is like, this is a presynaptic cell here, and this is a presynaptic cell, and we're thinking about these focal synapses, right? With this being our postsynaptic cell, right? So this is where graded potentials occur. It's the place where synapses between cells occur, and where stimulation of these cells can occur. Okay, so we could say graded potentials, right, are occurring at the soma, the cell body, and dendrites. Okay, and that really has to do with the stimuli that's being sensed here, uh, and the stimuli that's being passed along this axon. Okay, so we know a few things about action potentials. And I'm going to use this just to draw your attention to it. Then we're going to make a list differentiating these two. So we know, first of all, let's remind ourselves of this graph. This is -70 is our resting potential, right? So -70 millivolts, this is our resting potential. This -55 is our threshold potential. This voltage is in millivolts. And we have our time here in milliseconds. So in a typical action potential, there's a cell at rest. Nothing interesting is happening. That is at -70. Now, if there's some sort of a stimulus, and this is sort of where we just talked about action potentials, some sort of stimulus that gets us to this magical threshold potential, then we get this rapid depolarization and and repolarization, and then hyperpolarization down here, which we actually haven't labeled, but we probably should. This hyperpolarization here, I'll just say hyperpolarization, way below resting potential, and then finally back to the resting state. Right? And you can see a bunch of things about this. Or we know a bunch of things about this. If I were to measure an action potential, and where I'm doing it, of course, is along this axon. If I were to measure an action potential, 15 action potentials, at this spot right here along this axon, let's say I measure it right there, 15 different action potentials. They would all be of this same amplitude. They would all be this same time frame, right? If I were to measure those same action potentials down here, when they passed, when they got all the way down to this region, they would look exactly the same amplitude. It would take the same time to get there. So there's a bunch of things in that, right? Action potentials are all or nothing responses. They either occur or they don't. And when they do, they're exactly the same in their amplitude, which is about, for about 100 millivolt difference here, so quite large, right? So maybe about 100 millivolt difference. They are all the same time, so it takes 3 to 5 milliseconds to complete one of these action potentials, right? And they're unvarying in their amplitude or the time they take. In terms of where they're measured along the axon. So they're exactly the same here as they are there. Right? Okay, so this is going to allow us to make a little bit of a list of things that are true of action potentials. So for action potentials, the amplitude, right, is the same, right? So same for all action potentials in a given cell. It might be different for different cells, but within a given cell, the amplitude is always the same. So another way sort of saying that is it's unchanging across space and time, right? The duration of it is the same, right? Always the same. So for all action potentials, the timing it takes to complete them, right? That time period is always the same. Action potentials always are depolarizations followed by repolarizations, right? So we could also say that they're depolarizations caused by repolarizations. So it's always a depolarization followed by a repolarization. Something I neglected to mention before, or write out before, but we talked about it, is that the action potential amplitude is always very large, and that's on the order of 100 millivolt change in the potential. The channels involved, remember we talked about these as always being sodium, which are responsible for the depolarization, and potassium, which are responsible for the repolarization phase. And these are always voltage gated, right? Always voltage gated channels that are responding and opening and closing. So we've got our ions always being those positively charged ions. They're always moving through voltage gated channels in action potentials. Action potentials also have what are called refractory periods, and we haven't really talked about this yet, but we will get into a refractory period is is this period that begins here once threshold is crossed. And there's two parts of it. There's an absolute refractory period where no signal could cause channels to open again, because all the channels in this localized region of membrane where we're measuring this change in membrane potential, all of them are already opening, in the process of opening, or in the process of closing, right? All the sodium channels are already in the process of opening, or they are opened, all of them in this local region of membrane. So if another stimulus, depolarizing stimulus, were to arrive, so what? All the channels are already open. You can't get any more permeable than completely open, right? So all the way through this depolarization, and then once these channels close, and we'll talk about this more, these sodium channels close, they go through a period where they're incapable of being activated again. This is called their inactivation phase. And it's just because the conformation change they undergo when they close makes totally clogs the channel, and no stimulus can open that until we get down to about right here maybe, and then we move into what's called the relative refractory period, which goes all the way from about here all the way back to resting, because at this point the sodium channels are reset and could open again if another depolarizing stimulus came, but it would have to be a supernormal depolarizing stimulus, because imagine if the membrane potential is here, we'd have to get all the way back up to threshold. So not just this 15 millivolts that it took to get from -70 to -55, but perhaps 20 or 25 to get from whatever this is, -75, -80, -85, right? To get all the way up to threshold, right? So there's a refractory period here where channels are closed and inactive and no stimulus or a supernormal stimulus is required to get an action potential to fire again. So we have these refractory periods. We also have that at every step, and this is really why action potentials are the same amplitude and unvarying in shape and timing, is that they are reinitiated along every piece of the axon. So along every piece of this axon here, right? Along every piece of this axon, the action potential is actually reinitiated here and here and here and here and here. So there's no, so that's how it spreads, is by active reinitiation and opening and closing of channels all the way along here. Channels have to open and close in order to move this action potential along. And I think finally here, all action potentials are always triggered by a depolarization to threshold, right? What sets off this wave of this change in transmembrane potential that kind of looks like this wave is depolarization to threshold potential, where all those sodium channels in that local region of membrane then open. Okay, so I think this allows us now to contrast these with graded potentials and say a little bit more about graded potentials. I'm just going to draw on this for our graded potentials. So here, let's see. So here we've got our graded potentials. Right? So graded potentials. The amplitude is variable. You can actually see some graded potentials here. So it's variable. It can be something like a couple millivolts to, anywhere to like 15 millivolts, which might get us to threshold. It can be anywhere in there. The amplitude diminishes over space. So unlike an action potential, this amplitude actually diminishes as if you were to measure this graded potential further and further from the point of stimulus, the graded potential would get smaller and smaller. If we were to draw a graded potential on here, let's see, will this show up? Not very well. Let's get let's get an orange here for a graded potential. So this is a graded potential, right? These are both graded potentials. This is a graded potential. Look at the difference in amplitude. Look at also the difference in timing, right? So this is something else we've sort of talked about, right? That is variable. The timing that it lasts is variable as well. Now it could be that long. You know, some of these graded potentials are actually very, very long lasting, right? Like upwards of like 30, 40 milliseconds, right? So these could be somewhere like, 2 milliseconds to something like 40 milliseconds or even longer. Average is like 25 milliseconds, right? So yeah, the mean is like 25 milliseconds for most graded potentials. Graded potentials don't have to be depolarizations either. Graded potentials can be hyperpolarizations. So that's a graded potential, right? This is a graded potential as well, this dotted line, this dotted orange line. These are hyperpolarizations. They're still changes in transmembrane potential, and so they are graded potentials. But because they don't get to threshold, that's all they are, is graded potentials, and they can be either depolarizing, right, potentials like these are here, or hyperpolarizing like these are. And the reason is because different channels might open to produce graded potentials, right? So they are depolarizations or hyperpolarizations. And that's because a variety of different channels can open, right? The channels that open to produce graded depolarizations can be ligand gated, they can be mechanically gated, they can be opened by, or they can be gated by temperature changes. So you know that one thing that causes proteins to change shape is change in temperature, another is change in pH or the charge that they experience around them. So change in temperature can alter the conformation of these channel proteins and cause them to open or become more permeable to ions. Even intracellular molecules can alter open channels, right? So you can even have intracellular molecules opening channels. Okay, so those are the different things that can open the channels, but in terms of the ions responsible, these can be sodium channels, they can be potassium channels, they can be calcium channels. They can even be chloride channels. We haven't talked about chloride before, but chloride is at very high concentration outside the cell, low concentration inside the cell. And so that's why they can either be depolarizing or hyperpolarizing stimuli, because you know if a cell's at rest and you open a sodium channel or a calcium channel, you expect positive charge to flow in, depolarizing the cell toward threshold. But if you open potassium channels, you know there's a little bit of a concentration gradient on potassium to flow outward. So if you open more potassium channels, you're going to get an efflux of positive charges. You're actually going to get more negative, or a move in the negative direction, or a hyperpolarization further from zero, further from threshold when potassium enters. Same with chloride. It's at high concentration outside the cell and low inside. So if you open chloride channels, you're going to get an influx of negative charge into the cell, making that membrane potential difference larger, right? Or in other words, driving the cell into a more hyperpolarized state, further from zero, further from threshold. Okay, so then we have no refractory period. So once these channels are opened and close again, they're ready to open right away. So there is no refractory period. There is no period of inactivity for these channels, right? Now we can see here that the way these spread, right, is really, the way these depolarizations or repolarizations spread is passively. The stimulus is applied at a region of membrane or this connection, right, between cells here or here causes the influx of charge, but that influx of charge doesn't then initiate more channels to open in these neighboring parts of the membrane. It doesn't do that. It just pushes positive or negative charge in front of it. And so the spread along this membrane is very passive rather than being reinitiated at every point like we have with axons. Now, of course, if, we haven't talked about this yet, but if all these graded depolarizations and hyperpolarizations sum in this region here, the axon hillock, right? If they sum in this region to threshold, then we'll get an action potential fired, right? And this graded potentials will now become an action potential, but they just spread passively through the dendrites and along along the plasma membrane of the cell, rather than being reinitiated the way action potentials are. Now let's see. They're passive, right? So passive. Passive spread. Finally, let's just think about this. Two things. These can sum to get us to threshold, right? So you could have some summation happening in slightly different ways. And let me just kind of erase some of this here so we can see how this summation might occur. Okay, so we could have summation happening like this. We could have a little graded potential, doesn't get us to the threshold, but what if we get another stimulus right there that does get us to threshold? Then we'll start off an action potential, right? So if we think of these as being, there's the stimulus, and then there was, I don't want to cover that, another stimulus right there. This would be separated in time. These stimuli are separated in time. And so this would be temporal summation to get us to threshold. So this would be temporal summation of graded potentials. You could also have spatial summation of graded potentials. So you could have you could have two occurring right here, right? So let's have two occurring at the same time, but slightly different locations, right? If those then produced, right, a sum together to threshold, then that would be spatial summation. You can kind of see that if we look here, how that would happen. Now, if you got a stimulus at right here initiated because an action potential is transduced from this cell to another, and then, so that's at time, what was it, 0 down there, just looking down here. And then again here at time 0.5, right, milliseconds later, you get another one. Well, that might lead to, let's say it's sodium, to an influx of enough sodium, even though they're separated by a little bit of time, that might lead to the influx of enough sodium that by the time that graded potential diffuses all the way here to the axon hillock, it raises this membrane potential right here at the axon hillock to threshold. Alternatively, you could have, let's imagine we have calcium channels now. Alternatively, you could have at time 0 and at time 0, you could have spatial summation. So at the same time, you get a stimulus here that causes a graded potential and a stimulus here that causes a graded potential. And if those occur at the same time, and they collectively raise the transmembrane potential at the axon-Hill-Octa threshold, then you get an action potential fired. So you can get what's called spatial and temporal summation of graded potentials to reach action potential. With action potentials, you don't get any summation at all. And of course, this is because this is an all or nothing response. This is because throughout this entire rising and falling phase, this depolarization and repolarization, all the channels in that region of membrane that are open or that could be open are open, right? So there can be no additional opening of channels and an addition of charge to an area, because all the channels that could be open are open. And that's in contrast, of course, to graded potentials, where we get some channels opening and we get some charge flowing in, but we don't have all the channels, right, opening. Okay, I think that covers these major differences. Hopefully we can see now some of the differences between action potentials and graded potentials, and really how graded potentials can, if they are depolarizing graded potentials, sum to produce action potentials, right? And so it's good. It would be good to, a good activity follow-up to this would be to redraw some kind of connections like this, and draw on these membranes, these region of membranes, the type of channels you could have, what type of ion channel they are, and whether they're voltage gated, mechanically gated, temperature gated, ligand gated, right? So do that for here and for along the axon, and you might as well also do it for the synaptic terminal, what type of channels we have there. Okay. Please let me know if you have any questions about this, and we'll see you in a future recording.